Caterina Sforza, Renaissance Society and the Role of Women. Today I will be talking to you about guided reading. Whenever you read a source, whether it be a primary source or a secondary source, you want to be engaged in your reading. You want to be asking questions. You want to be taking notes. And so I'm going to use the Caterina Sforza story to show you what I mean by guided reading. So Caterina Sforza, Renaissance Society, and the Role of Women. Burckhardt was certain that Renaissance brought, in his words, the equalization of classes, as well as an improvement in the status of women. More recently, Burckhardt's theories have been seriously challenged, calling into question not only the role of women in the Renaissance, but the impact the Renaissance had on an entire society of the time. So my first question might be, what was the role of women during the Renaissance? Was it different than it had been in earlier ages? Born in 1462, as the unwanted and illegitimate offspring of Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Caterina Sforza received not the classical education of the Renaissance ruler, but the barely adequate education of most noblewomen of the time. She was taught little more than how to read and write, something of the lives of the saints, and a few prayers. Caterina was trained not to rule, but to be an attractive candidate on the marriage market. So she was illegitimate. Did that affect her schooling? She received a basic education. Caterina was trained not to rule, but to be an attractive candidate on the marriage market, a support but not a challenge to men. Marriage, to which her life was to be devoted, was not then an institution dedicated to mutual fidelity and love, but to the production of male heirs and the cementing of alliances between dynastic families and states. So her role was to be married and have children. Relationship between two families. The typical expectation. Marriage, and possibly death and childbirth, was the most to which Caterina and most women of her class could look forward to. Caterina was first betrothed to the young son of one of Galeazzo's favorite condottieri, but the boy died before reaching a marital age. Her future was quickly and more certainly decided for her. Galeazzo resolved to arrange a marriage alliance between his family and that of Girolamo Rurio. Girolamo was the precise opposite of the idealized Renaissance prince. So what was the ideal Renaissance prince? Variously described as low-born, uncouth, boorish, cruel, and cowardly, Girolamo was first betrothed to an obscure niece of Francisco Sforza. The negotiations broke down when Girolamo insisted upon sleeping with that girl, then 12 years old, on the conclusion of the marriage contract. Even in the context of this time, this was beastly behavior. So what is Caterina getting for a husband? Eek! Nonetheless, Galeazzo and Girolamo were not to be deterred. Galeazzo offered his daughter to the obnoxious Girolamo. Then only 9 years old, Caterina, slender, attractive, and blonde, most likely did not protest. It was not expected that she would do so, and it was probably true that she feared the wrath of her father every bit as much as that of Girolamo. To cement the marriage agreement, Galeazzo provided a handsome dowry. So, she was typical. She was afraid of both husband and father. But she did come with a dowry. In 1477, when she was just 14, Caterina was married to much older Girolamo Rorario. Soon Caterina became pregnant and at the age of 15 produced an unwanted girl. An unwanted girl. What did we want? Boys. Girolamo was also frustrated in his political plots. The Pazzi conspiracy had failed, and the resulting war, from which the Rarios expected to gain much territory, was ended by an artful diplomacy of Lorenzo de' Medici. Girolamo had to be content with Imola and the small duchy of Friuli, a disappointment only partly relieved by Caterina's gifts of 2 sons by 1480. A year or two later, as the mother of 3 children, Caterina took her place as Duchess of Imola and Forli. In 1484, Girolamo went to war and achieved some success, but it was limited. In short order, the Roman mob turned on the Rorario palace, tearing it to pieces. Caterina, with her husband on a battlefield outside Rome, asserted herself for the first time. Heavy with child, she rode from the battlefield to Rome and seized control of the major papal fortress. She took the fortress, heavy with child? Not typical. There was a hope for a time that Girolamo might influence the election of a new pope by threatening Rome with his army, but he was bought off with a few concessions and frightened by his enemies. Girolamo was forced to return to Flori, challenged by his enemies and by his newly assertive wife. Girolamo fell gravely and chronically ill, and Caterina began to rule in his name. So is it typical for the wife to rule in the husband's name? She used it with, once again, enjoying the taste of power. She used it with zest. In 1487, with her husband in a sickbed and herself due to bear a child, Caterina rode from the Imola to Forli to smash a revolt. Once there, she personally saw to it that 6 of the conspirators were beheaded, drawn, and quartered, and ordered the remains to be displayed on pikes and battlements throughout the city. She gave birth to her child soon afterward. So the use of terror. Despite Caterina's efforts to preserve his power, Girolamo did not survive. His fall came when he angered the vindictive family Orsi, who in 1488 attacked and killed Girolamo in his own palace. Caterina, with her children who were elsewhere, escaped the bloodshed, but were seized and put under close guard by the Orsi. After an initial panic, Caterina, whose sense of self-preservation was very keen, managed to outwit her captors with a combination of treachery and guile. Convincing the Orsi that she could arrange the surrender of the local fortress if she were allowed to negotiate with the defenders, Caterina was allowed inside and, of course, did not return. She is cunning. She is witty. She is cunning. Safe inside, she waited reinforcements arranged by her Sforza relations, and when they arrived, she used them to round up her conspirators and to terrorize the local citizens into returning almost all the plundered property to the palace. Many of the male conspirators were caught, imprisoned, or dispatched during a gory day of retribution, public torture, and execution. It is of note that Caterina, in an uncommon act of generosity, freed most of the terrified Orsi women. Did she free them? Free the women? Because she herself was a woman? Or what was the reason? Caterina was now a lady of 40, and she clung to a real, if illegal, power for as long as she could. When her eldest son came of age, she not only refused to surrender power to him, but took 2 lovers, defiantly producing male children by both. So now she's ruling illegally. When her eldest son came of age, there it is, sorry. Only in 1499 did an end finally come to Caterina's power. In that year, Cesare Borgia, the violent patron of Leonardo and Machiavelli, attacked Imola and Forli as a part of his campaign to conquer Romagna. In spite of Caterina's efforts, which included a gallant defense and a plot to assassinate Pope Alexander VI, both cities were conquered and Caterina, after some difficulty, captured. After brutalizing and raping her, Caesar threw her into a dungeon in Rome to force her to surrender the Rario inheritance. Caterina, true to form, I would be underlining that, highlighting, true to form, at first refused and even tried to escape. Eventually, however, she gave in. Released, aged by her captivity, she was allowed to go to Florence. There, in 1509, overweight and suffering from a formidable combination of physical infirmities, she died. It must have been hard to believe that she was gone, and hard to believe that she had only lived for 46 years. What do we want to say? We want to say, go girl. True to form. Trying to escape. So the question is then, was she typical? Was she typical? What was expected of a Renaissance woman? All right, so now we're on to the next page. So Caterina's story is done. Now we're looking at, all right, so where are Renaissance women? It would be absurd to propose, as some have, that Caterina was in any way a typical Renaissance woman, or that she was in a way a forerunner of the emancipated female. What her life does reveal is some of the weaknesses in the argument that the Renaissance improved the status of women. So did it improve the status of women? Caterina came to power as an exception. She came to power as an exception. Precisely because she had the capacity and the panache to violate accepted standards of female behavior. She broke the rules. The Renaissance idealized manners and good conduct for women as well as men, but Caterina has left no indication of believing in either. She seized power from her husband and also from her son, and held it not by right or custom, but by competence and force. Caterina expected to do nothing but produce children, surprise contemporaries because she learned from the violence around her, personally experiencing the brutalities of Renaissance politics, and ultimately turning brutal herself. For this, she was respected for her forcefulness, but not for her sex. So why was she respected? Did they forget she was a woman? Many of the Renaissance humanists, drawing as they did from the dualism found in many of the Greek philosophers, were not always affirmative about women's roles. Leone Battista Alberti, one of the most revered of the Florentine humanists, wrote a dialogue on the family, which perhaps sheds light on the place of women in great merchant houses of the time. The merchant's wife in Alberti's work was to be obedient, passive, submissive, never to be trusted by a husband who rightfully dominated her. Was Alberti, where did Caterina fit in Alberti's writings? She didn't. Despite Caterina's efforts, intellectual attitudes towards women were reinforced by biological, practical, and religious factors. Religion, which remained a much stronger force among the Renaissance upper classes, supported the ideal of chastity and virginity, which was ever before young upper-class women. Marriage was only a practical affair which was to safeguard the honor and the welfare of not only the bride and groom but also of their families. Women found husbands in Renaissance Italy not because of their wit and learning, but because of their status, of their families, and the size of their dowries, and their habits, honor, and reputations. In this sense, Caterina Sforza seems much less unusual. So Caterina was typical at the beginning of her was typical at the beginning of her life. Marriage, babies. Caterina Sforza seems much less unusual. Her strength of character and astonishing behavior emerged only some years after her marriage, and in unusual circumstances. Up until that time, she fulfilled all the expected functions of a young woman of her class. Caterina married the husband chosen for her, and thus forged with her body an alliance between two powerful families. She brought to her husband not only a handsome dowry, but territory and a title, and the biological capacity to produce male heirs. By the standards of the time, Rario and his family had every reason to be pleased. Now remember, she was also illegitimate. So the number of illegitimate births in 15th century Italy has prompted some to call it the Golden Age of Bastardy. Pope Pius II, one of the most humane and able of the Renaissance pontiffs, remarked, "Most of the rulers of Italy in the present day were born out of wedlock." It became almost standard behavior for the Renaissance princes and rulers, and many others, to arrange illicit liaisons with lower class women. While many of the offspring of such unions were legitimized and taken into households of their fathers, as Caterina Sforza was, the effect could only be to weaken the position of legitimate children in the household and the wives who bore them. So Caterina also has that piece. Is she typical of Renaissance women as illegitimate? Attitudes towards women also reflected the proliferation of prostitution in Renaissance Italy. In Florence, courtesans, wearing the gloves and bells that identified them, plied their trade so publicly that government established communal brothels in 1415 to remove them from the streets and from public view. The high likelihood of death from childbirth also weakened family ties and the position of women. On the other hand, a woman who possessed a large dowry could, if the provision of dowry payment was favorable to her or controlled by her, sometimes have a say in her fate and the fates of her daughters. In either case, however, women were valued less for their personal qualities and more for the wealth or prestige they brought to the marriage. And I think that is really your summary. So that in either case, however, women were valued less for their personal qualities and more for the wealth or prestige they brought to the marriage. So going back, did the lives of women change because of the Renaissance? Were they impacted by humanism? And I think you can all see for yourself that that idea is very questionable.